I went to surprise my fiancée at work, and her boss was coming out of the bathroom. Malcolm Ray walked out of that bathroom adjusting his belt, and the first thing I noticed was the perfume. Hers, mixed with his cologne, hanging in the air like a confession. I stood there in the lobby of Crawford & Associates holding a bouquet of sunflowers, her favorite, watching this man smooth down his tie and button his jacket with the kind of ease that comes from practice. The receptionist had buzzed me through without questions because I'd been there before, brought Imani lunch on busy days, kissed her goodbye in this same marble-floored entrance. Malcolm's eyes met mine across the space, and he didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't offer an explanation. Instead, he smiled, not apologetic, not embarrassed, just knowing, like we were suddenly in on something together. My name is Darius Cole, and this is my revenge story. But before we continue, don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment with the city you're watching from. It really helps me bring you more stories. I heard her voice before I saw her, that nervous laugh she does when she's caught off guard, and then Imani appeared from the hallway in her navy dress, the one she'd ironed that morning while telling me about her presentation. Her lipstick was smudged at the corner, barely noticeable unless you knew exactly how she applied it every morning at the bathroom mirror. 3 careful strokes and a blot with tissue. She froze when she saw me, and for half a second her face showed everything: panic, guilt, calculation, before she rearranged it into surprise and delight. "Baby, what are you doing here?" she said, moving toward me with her arms out, and I let her hug me because I didn't know what else to do. Malcolm walked past us toward the elevators, pressed the button, and said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Cole," like we were strangers being polite. The elevator doors closed on his face, and he was still smiling. When I pulled back from the embrace, I looked down at her neck and saw the mark, reddish, fresh, right below her ear where her pulse beat visible and fast. She saw me see it, and her hand flew up instinctively before dropping back down, both of us knowing it was too late to pretend. "Emergency meeting," she said, her voice too bright, too quick. "Malcolm needed my input on the Henderson account, and you know how demanding he can be." She took the flowers from my hand and smelled them, closing her eyes a beat too long like she was buying time to think. I nodded because words felt impossible, because my throat had closed up around something hard and bitter, because I'd driven 40 minutes through Atlanta traffic believing I was doing something sweet and romantic. The receptionist watched us from behind her desk with careful disinterest, the kind that meant she'd seen this before, knew the script, had probably watched Malcolm leave that bathroom with other women's perfume on his collar. Imani walked me back to the elevator, her hand on my arm like she was steadying herself instead of me, and asked about my day with the forced enthusiasm of someone changing the subject. I told her about the network issue I'd fixed at the bank downtown, how the manager had been grateful enough to tip me $50 cash, and she laughed at the right moments and squeezed my hand and acted like her whole world wasn't falling apart behind her eyes. The elevator arrived empty, and before I stepped in, she kissed me on the mouth, harder than necessary, longer than natural, and I tasted mint and desperation and something else I couldn't name. "I love you," she said, and it sounded like an apology and a lie and a plea all wrapped together. I said, "I love you too," because that's what I'd always said, what I'd said every day for 3 years, what I'd said when I proposed 6 months ago in that restaurant overlooking the city while strangers applauded. The elevator descended through 12 floors, and I watched the numbers light up one by one, each one taking me further from the woman I thought I knew and closer to whatever truth was waiting on the other side of my denial. My reflection stared back at me from the polished steel doors. 33 years old, decent-looking, steady job fixing computers and networks for small businesses, faithful, trusting, stupid. The flowers hung upside down in my hand, already wilting in the recycled air, and I realized she hadn't even asked why I'd come, what the surprise was for, if there was an occasion I was celebrating. In the parking garage, I sat in my 10-year-old Honda and stared at the concrete pillar in front of me until security asked if I was okay. I wasn't okay, but I told him I was fine, started the engine, and drove home in silence. The apartment felt different when I walked in, like the furniture had shifted slightly while I was gone, like the air itself knew what I knew and was holding its breath. I set the sunflowers on the kitchen counter and watched them lean against the tile backsplash, their stems bent, their petals already starting to brown at the edges. Everything looked exactly as we'd left it that morning. Her coffee cup in the sink, my work boots by the door, the throw blanket she always folded wrong on the couch, but none of it felt like home anymore. I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and tried to focus on a client's server migration, but the code on the screen blurred into meaningless symbols, and all I could see was Malcolm's smile, that knowing, intimate curl of his lips that said he'd won something I hadn't known we were competing for. Imani came home 3 hours later with takeout from the Thai place we liked, the one that gave us extra spring rolls because we came in every Friday. She kissed my cheek and unpacked the containers with too much energy, talking fast about her day, about the Henderson account, about how Malcolm was so impressed with her presentation that he was considering her for senior analyst. I watched her move around our small kitchen, opening drawers, grabbing plates, pouring wine into the glasses we'd gotten as an engagement gift from her mother. She was performing normalcy, executing each gesture with the careful precision of someone following a script, and I sat there letting her do it because I didn't know how to write a different scene. The food tasted like cardboard in my mouth, but I ate it anyway, nodding when she paused for responses, making sounds of interest when she expected them. After dinner, she curled up next to me on the couch and turned on the show we'd been watching together, some drama about lawyers in New York that she loved and I tolerated. Her head rested on my shoulder, her hand on my chest, her breathing steady and calm like this was just another Thursday night in our ordinary life. But every few minutes she'd shift position slightly, adjust her hair, clear her throat, little tells that her body was tense even though her voice stayed light. I put my arm around her the way I always did, and she melted into me with what might have been relief, or guilt, or both, and I felt the wrongness of it like a splinter under my skin that I couldn't reach. The TV flickered in the dark room, voices arguing about ethics and justice and truth, and the irony was so heavy I almost laughed. Around 11, her phone buzzed on the coffee table, screen lighting up with a notification she lunged for before I could see it clearly. "Work stuff," she said, silencing it and flipping it face down. But I'd caught the preview, meeting with M, followed by a time, 11:30 p.m. She stood up, stretched like she was tired, said she needed to shower before bed because she'd been running around all day, and felt gross. I heard the bathroom door close, the lock click, the water start, and I sat there in the blue glow of the television listening to her sing behind the glass and tile, some Fiancée song about love and loyalty. The phone sat on the table between us like evidence, like a loaded gun, like a door I wasn't sure I wanted to open. I picked it up and entered her passcode, her mother's birthday, same code she'd had for 2 years, the one she'd given me freely because we don't have secrets. The phone unlocked without resistance, and I navigated to her calendar with hands that shook despite my best efforts to stay calm. Meeting with M. Appeared every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for the past 3 months. Always late evening, always marked private, always at an address I didn't recognize. I scrolled through her messages next, found the thread with Malcolm Ray near the top, opened it with my heart hammering so hard I thought it might crack a rib. The texts were professional until they weren't. Lunch plans that became dinner plans that became, "I can't stop thinking about you at 2 a.m." Photos I couldn't make myself look at. Promises about when this is all settled, and once we're careful enough, and patience, baby. The shower shut off and I closed everything, put the phone back exactly where she'd left it, returned to my position on the couch like I'd never moved. Imani came out in her robe with her hair wrapped in a towel, smelling like coconut and vanilla, and she smiled at me with such genuine warmth that for a second I wondered if I'd imagined everything, if I'd constructed a betrayal out of paranoia and insecurity. But then she picked up her phone, saw something that made her smile in a way she hadn't smiled at me in months, and typed a quick response before announcing she was exhausted and heading to bed. I told her I'd be there soon, that I wanted to finish the episode, and she kissed the top of my head and left me alone with the evidence of who we'd really become. The lawyers on TV reached their verdict. Someone won, someone lost, and I sat there in the dark knowing that my trial had only just begun. Friday morning, Imani made pancakes from scratch, something she hadn't done since my birthday last year, and the gesture felt like an apology for sins she thought I didn't know about. She moved around the kitchen humming that Fiancée song, flipping perfect golden circles while bacon sizzled in the cast-iron skillet, and the domestic scene was so carefully constructed it felt like theater. I sat at the table drinking coffee and watching her perform this version of herself. The loving fiancée, the woman who cared, the partner who made breakfast because she wanted to, not because she needed to shore up a crumbling lie. She served the plates with a flourish, sat across from me, and reached for my hand before we ate, her thumb rubbing circles on my palm like she used to do when we first started dating. "I'm lucky to have you," she said, looking directly into my eyes, and I wondered if she believed it or if this was just another line in the script. The pancakes tasted like guilt, sweet and heavy, and I ate them while she talked about wedding plans, asking my opinion on flowers and venues and invitation fonts like any of it mattered anymore. She'd been stalling on setting a date for months, always citing work stress or budget concerns or wanting to get the promotion first so we can do it right. And now I understood that the promotion wasn't the goal. Malcolm was. I nodded along, suggested the magnolias she'd mentioned once, agreed that spring made more sense than summer for an outdoor ceremony, played my part in this charade because I wasn't ready to burn it all down yet. She beamed at my answers, pulled out her phone to show me Pinterest boards she'd been updating, and I looked at pictures of white dresses and flower arrangements while thinking about the text messages I'd read last night, the ones that called her baby and promised her everything. After breakfast, she got ready for work with extra care, trying on 3 different outfits before settling on a cream blouse and gray pencil skirt that I'd complimented before. She asked me to zip her up, and I did, my fingers brushing the skin of her back where another man's hands had been, and the intimacy of the gesture felt like a violation. At the door, she kissed me longer than necessary, told me she loved me 3 times, and reminded me that she had drinks with the girls after work so she'd be home late. The girls was her usual excuse, her standard cover, and I'd believed it every time because I was the kind of man who trusted his woman, who didn't check phones or track locations or suspect betrayal. But that man died in the lobby of Crawford & Associates, and whoever I was now had different rules. I gave her 30 minutes after she left, then opened my laptop and pulled up the software I used for client device management, location tracking, remote access, monitoring tools that businesses paid me to install on their employee phones and computers. Installing it on Imani's phone would take 5 minutes if I had physical access, but I didn't need that anymore because I'd already cloned her data when she asked me to fix something 2 weeks ago. Technology was my language, my territory, the one place where I had power that Malcolm Ray and his expensive suits and corner office couldn't touch. I activated the tracking, linked it to my phone, and watched a blue dot appear on the map of Atlanta, moving north toward downtown, toward Crawford & Associates, toward whatever lie she'd prepared for today. The apartment felt enormous and empty once I was alone with the truth, and I spent the day trying to work but mostly staring at that blue dot, watching it sit stationary for hours at her office before moving at lunch to a restaurant I recognized, the Italian place where Malcolm took clients, where reservations ran 6 weeks out unless you knew the owner. She stayed there 90 minutes, long enough for a 3-course meal, long enough for wine and dessert and hands under the table. At 3 p.m. the dot moved again, this time to the address I'd seen in her calendar, the one marked Meeting with M. I pulled it up on Google Maps and stared at the luxury high-rise in Buckhead, 30 floors of glass and steel and monthly rents that cost more than I made in 3 months. Unit 2847 was listed in public records under an LLC that took me 20 minutes to trace back to Malcolm Ray's name. I sat there in my kitchen, in the apartment Imani and I had picked out together 3 years ago because it was affordable and close to both our jobs, and looked at the tracking map showing she was in another man's home in the middle of a workday. The blue dot didn't move for 2 hours. When it finally did, heading back downtown toward her office, I closed the laptop and sat in the silence, trying to remember who I'd been before I knew, if that version of me had been happier or just more ignorant. My phone buzzed with a text from her. "Missing you, baby. Can't wait to see you tonight." And I responded with a heart emoji because that's what I always did, what she expected, what would keep her comfortable and unsuspecting while I figured out what came next. The sun moved across the floor in a slow arc, and I sat there watching the light change, feeling something cold and patient settle into my chest where anger should have been. The tracking app became my new routine, my secret window into Imani's parallel life, and I watched her movements like a documentary filmmaker observing his subject from a distance. Every morning she left for work at exactly 8:15, stopped at the same Starbucks for her vanilla latte, arrived at Crawford & Associates by 8:40, and her blue dot would sit there motionless until lunch. But Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays were different. Those days the dot would drift north to Buckhead around 2 p.m., stay parked at Malcolm's building for 2 to 3 hours, then return downtown like nothing had happened. She'd come home to me smelling like his cologne, her hair different from how she'd worn it that morning, her phone face down on every surface, and she'd kiss me and ask about my day and cook dinner like she was earning back something she'd stolen. I stopped confronting the evidence in my head, stopped trying to give her the benefit of the doubt, and instead started documenting everything. Screenshots of her location at Malcolm's address, timestamps of how long she stayed, photos of text messages that came through late at night when she thought I was sleeping. I created a folder on my encrypted hard drive labeled Network Backup 2024 and filled it with the kind of proof that couldn't be explained away, couldn't be minimized, couldn't be blamed on my paranoia or insecurity. Technology had always been my strength, the skill that paid our bills and fixed our problems, and now it became my weapon, silent and precise and patient. Every morning I'd check the tracking, every night I'd update the folder, and between those rituals I went through my regular life installing routers and debugging systems and pretending everything was fine. On Wednesday night, Imani came home at 9:30 with wine on her breath and a story about client drinks that had run long, and I listened to her talk while mentally checking the timeline against her location data. She'd been at Malcolm's building from 2 until 7, not at any bar or restaurant, not anywhere near clients or coworkers. She kicked off her heels and collapsed on the couch with dramatic exhaustion, pulling me down next to her, resting her head on my shoulder like I was home base, like I was safe, like I was the fool who'd never figure it out. "I'm so tired of these long days," she said, and I stroked her hair and agreed that her job was demanding and asked if the promotion was getting closer. Her eyes lit up when I mentioned it, and she launched into a speech about next month's performance review and how Malcolm had basically promised her the senior analyst position if she kept up the good work. I asked her what kind of good work, keeping my voice casual, and she described projects I could verify were mostly handled by other team members, presentations I could see in shared files that bore other people's names. The promotion was a carrot Malcolm dangled to keep her compliant, a reward that would probably never come because men like him didn't reward their mistresses with career advancement. They rewarded them with secrets and lies and eventually public humiliation when the game got boring. But Imani couldn't see it or wouldn't, blinded by whatever promises he'd made in that high-rise apartment while I was fixing someone's email server across town. She fell asleep on my chest that night, her breathing deep and peaceful, while I lay awake staring at the ceiling running scenarios in my head, calculating moves and counter-moves like I was debugging the world's worst program. Thursday morning, I broke my own rule and called in sick to a client, something I never did, and drove to Buckhead with no plan except to see the building for myself. Malcolm's high-rise sat on Peachtree like a monument to wealth, all glass and modern architecture, with a doorman and valet and security that screened visitors in a marble lobby that probably cost more than my entire apartment. I parked across the street in a public garage and watched the entrance through my car window, feeling ridiculous and desperate and justified all at once. At 2:15, Malcolm's black Mercedes pulled up to the valet, and he stepped out in a charcoal suit looking exactly like what he was. Successful, confident, untouchable. 20 minutes later, Imani's silver Camry arrived, and she handed her keys to the same valet like she'd done it before, like she belonged there, like this was routine. I watched her disappear into that lobby, her red dress catching the afternoon sun, her hair done in the style she usually saved for special occasions, and something in me went very still and very cold. This wasn't a woman sneaking around ashamed of what she was doing. This was a woman walking into what she thought was her future, head high, confident, already imagining herself belonging to Malcolm's world of luxury and status and expensive zip codes. The doorman held the door for her with a familiar nod, and I realized she wasn't just his mistress. She was a regular, someone the staff recognized and accommodated and probably pitied because they'd seen this movie before and knew how it ended. I sat in that parking garage for 3 hours, watching expensive cars come and go, watching people in designer clothes navigate a world I'd never be invited into, understanding for the first time that Malcolm hadn't just stolen my fiancée, he'd offered her an upgrade. At 6 p.m., I drove home and opened my laptop and started doing the kind of research I usually did for security audits, the kind that looked for vulnerabilities and weak points and ways into systems that seemed impenetrable. Malcolm Ray had a digital footprint like anyone else. Social media carefully curated but not locked down. Professional profiles on LinkedIn with connections I could map. A wife named Vanessa Ray, whose Instagram showed a perfect life of charity galas and vacation homes and smiling photos that didn't quite reach her eyes. I dug deeper, finding property records and business registrations and financial disclosures that painted a picture of a man who'd built his success on charm and connections and strategic marriages. Vanessa came from money, old Atlanta money that had funded Malcolm's career in ways his MBA never could have alone. And now he was risking it all for a 29-year-old analyst who thought sleeping with the boss was a career strategy. Friday night, Imani texted that she was going to the Buckhead location again, disguised in her message as late meeting with client, and I made a decision that probably crossed some line I'd regret later. I drove to Malcolm's building and parked in the same garage, watching that doorman, that valet, that lobby that glowed like a beacon of everything I wasn't. The rational part of my brain said to go home, to gather my evidence quietly, to leave with dignity before this consumed me completely. But the other part, the part that had been gutted and humiliated and lied to for months, needed to see it with my own eyes, needed to make it real beyond blue dots on screens and time-stamped screenshots. I sat there for an hour watching the building's windows light up as dusk fell across Atlanta, trying to guess which one was Unit 2847, which square of warm light contained my fiancée and her boss celebrating their betrayal. Around 8 p.m., the elevator in the parking garage opened behind my car, and a woman stepped out moving fast, her heels clicking against concrete, her breathing harsh and uneven in the underground silence. I recognized her from Instagram before she even reached her car, Vanessa Ray, in a black dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her makeup perfect except for the tears-cutting tracks through her foundation. She stopped 3 spaces from me, leaning against a silver Range Rover like she needed it to hold her up, and pressed her palms against her eyes in a gesture of defeat so raw I looked away. But she'd already seen me, had already clocked the stranger sitting alone in a parked car, and when our eyes met there was recognition there, not of faces but of situations. 2 people in the same parking garage for the same terrible reason. She walked over to my car, and I rolled down the window because what else was I going to do? Pretend I wasn't there for exactly what she thought I was there for. "You're Imani's fiancé," she said, not a question, and I nodded because my voice had disappeared somewhere between surprise and shame. Vanessa laughed, bitter and broken, and said, "I saw you at the office once, bringing her flowers." I remember thinking how sweet that was, how lucky she was. She wasn't crying anymore, had collected herself with the discipline of someone used to performing composure, and when she looked at the building behind us, her face went hard. "They're up there right now," she said, "Unit 2847. He thinks I'm at my book club. She probably thinks you're home fixing someone's computer." The accuracy of that last part hit me like a punch, and Vanessa saw it land, nodded like she understood everything. She opened her purse and pulled out a folder. Expensive leather, monogrammed, the kind of thing that held important documents and billion-dollar contracts. "I've known for 6 months," she said, handing it to me through the window. "Hired a private investigator, got the photos, the hotel receipts, the credit card statements. Malcolm's been sloppy. He always is when he thinks he's in love." I took the folder like it might explode, and when I opened it I saw exactly what she'd promised. Photos of Malcolm and Imani at restaurants I couldn't afford, entering hotel rooms in cities I recognized from Imani's work trips, emails discussing meeting times and locations and making sure no one finds out until after the divorce. That last part stopped me cold, and Vanessa saw my reaction, saw me understand what Imani had been planning, what future she'd been building while telling me about wedding venues and honeymoon destinations. "Here's what I'm thinking," Vanessa said, leaning against my car like we were old friends sharing war stories. "We can either sit here crying about what they did to us, or we can make them regret it. I've got the resources, lawyers, connections, leverage that can destroy Malcolm's career. But I need someone who can do the technical side. Someone who can make sure every piece of evidence is ironclad. Someone who can dig up things even my expensive investigator couldn't find." She looked at me directly, and I saw past the tears and designer clothes to someone who'd been underestimated her whole life. Someone who'd played the society wife while staying 5 steps ahead of the game. "You're in tech, right? Security systems, networks, all that digital forensic stuff?" I nodded, still holding the folder, still processing that this stranger was offering me an alliance. "Then here's my proposal. We bring them down together, legally and thoroughly, and when it's over, you walk away with everything you need to start fresh." I asked her why she was trusting me, why she was sharing evidence that could be used against her in divorce court, why she was risking her own leverage on a stranger in a parking garage. Vanessa smiled, sad and knowing, and said, "Because misery loves company, and revenge loves partners. Because I saw your face when I mentioned the divorce plans, and I know you're not going to do anything stupid like run up there and make a scene. You're like me. You're going to be smart about this. Patient, thorough." She handed me a business card, her personal cell number written on the back in elegant script. "Think about it over the weekend. If you want in, call me Monday. If not, keep the folder as a gift. You'll need it for your own divorce." She walked back to her Range Rover, started the engine, and drove out of that garage, leaving me alone with evidence of my fiancé's betrayal and an offer I couldn't quite believe was real. I sat there until 9:30, until Imani's blue dot started moving away from the building, until I had enough time to get home before she did and pretend I'd been there all evening. The folder sat on my passenger seat like a bomb, and I drove through Atlanta Friday night traffic thinking about Vanessa's offer, about leverage and evidence and smart revenge versus the dumb kind that ended with someone in jail or broke or worse off than before. Imani came home at 10, singing some song under her breath, kissed me like she meant it, and fell asleep wrapped around me like I was still hers, like we were still us, like the past 3 months hadn't turned everything we had into a complicated lie. I lay awake listening to her breathe, feeling the folder in my backpack in the corner, feeling the weight of Vanessa's business card in my pocket, feeling something shift inside me from victim to strategist. Monday couldn't come fast enough. I called Vanessa Ray on Monday morning from a coffee shop downtown, using a burner phone I'd bought over the weekend because paranoia had become my new normal. She answered on the first ring like she'd been waiting, and her voice was calm and businesslike, none of Friday's emotion bleeding through. We met at a restaurant in Virginia Highland, neutral territory, the kind of place where 2 people having coffee wouldn't draw attention from anyone who knew either of us. She arrived exactly on time wearing dark sunglasses and a blazer that screamed lawyer or CEO, and when she sat across from me she didn't waste time on small talk or sympathy. "I need to know you're serious," she said. "This isn't about getting even or feeling better. This is about systematically dismantling everything Malcolm's built, and your fiancé is collateral damage. Can you handle that?" I told her I'd spent the weekend in the folder she'd given me, cross-referencing dates and locations with Imani's calendar and text messages, building a timeline that was airtight and devastating. I'd found discrepancies in Malcolm's expense reports, personal charges disguised as business meals, hotel rooms booked on company cards for cities where Crawford and Associates had no clients. I'd mapped his pattern. The affair wasn't his first, probably wouldn't be his last, and he'd been careless enough to leave a trail that any decent forensic accountant could follow straight to termination and possibly fraud charges. Vanessa listened to my breakdown with the focus of someone taking notes for an exam, and when I finished, she smiled for the first time since I'd met her. "You're better than my investigator," she said, "and you work faster." She laid out her plan like a general briefing troops before battle, and I realized I'd underestimated her the same way Malcolm had. She wasn't just the rich wife funding his career. She was strategic and connected and had been planning this long before she met me in that parking garage. Her father's law firm handled corporate litigation, which meant she had access to employment lawyers who specialized in executive misconduct. Her best friend from college was on the board at Crawford and Associates, which meant she had an inside line to the people who actually made firing decisions. She'd been collecting evidence for months, but she needed the digital component, emails, text records, location data, to make the case ironclad. "Malcolm's careful with paper trails," she explained, "but he's arrogant about technology. He thinks deleting texts and clearing browser history is enough." I asked her what she wanted from me specifically, and she pulled out a contract, an actual employment agreement drafted by lawyers, offering me a position as cybersecurity consultant for her new venture. The salary line made me blink twice. $200,000 a year, triple what I made cobbling together freelance clients and small business contracts. "I'm starting a tech security firm," Vanessa said. "High-end clients, corporate espionage prevention, digital forensics for law firms handling white-collar crime. I need someone who's brilliant, discreet, and motivated. You tick all 3 boxes." The offer felt surreal, like I'd walked into someone else's life, but the contract was real, the numbers were real, and the implication was clear. Help her destroy Malcolm, and she'd rebuild me into someone who belonged in rooms I'd never had access to before. But first, we needed to execute the plan she'd been perfecting for 6 months, and my role was to provide the evidence her investigators couldn't legally obtain. I needed to document every interaction between Malcolm and Imani, every promise he'd made about promotions and divorces and futures together, every email that showed he'd used company resources to conduct an affair with a subordinate. More than that, I needed to find the other women. Vanessa was certain Imani wasn't the first analyst he'd seduced with promises of career advancement, and if we could find a pattern, we could turn misconduct into a systemic problem that the board couldn't ignore. "Malcolm's greatest strength is his charm," Vanessa said. "People believe him because they want to, but even charm breaks when you stack enough evidence against it." We spent 2 hours in that restaurant mapping out timelines and deadlines, dividing responsibilities and establishing communication protocols that kept us both protected. Vanessa would handle the board politics and legal maneuvering, using her connections to plant seeds of doubt about Malcolm's judgment and ethics. I would handle the digital investigation, building a case file that could withstand scrutiny from corporate lawyers and HR departments. We'd work in parallel for the next month, gathering everything we needed, and then we'd strike during the company's annual gala, a black tie event where Malcolm was scheduled to give the keynote and announce his strategic hires, which almost certainly included promoting Imani. The timing was perfect, theatrical, the kind of public humiliation that would make recovery impossible. Vanessa shook my hand across the table, and I felt the weight of the alliance settle onto my shoulders like armor I wasn't sure I was strong enough to wear. The next 3 weeks turned me into someone I barely recognized, someone who smiled at his fiancée over breakfast while recording her phone calls, someone who made love to her at night while mentally cataloging inconsistencies in her stories. I played the role of oblivious partner so well that Imani relaxed her guard, started bringing work home again, leaving her laptop open on the kitchen table while she showered. I'd wait until I heard the water running, then clone her hard drive in under 5 minutes, pulling emails and documents and chat logs that painted a picture of calculated ambition mixed with genuine delusion. She really believed Malcolm would leave Vanessa, really thought the promotion was about her talent and not her compliance, really convinced herself that what they had was special enough to blow up 2 relationships over. I found the emails Vanessa had mentioned, the ones discussing post-divorce plans, and they were worse than I'd imagined. Malcolm wrote about taking Imani to Paris once he was free, about buying her a condo in the city once his finances were settled, about making her a partner at his firm once they could be public. Every promise was conditional, timed to some future event that would never come, and reading them felt like watching someone fall for the oldest con in history. But mixed in with Malcolm's lies were Imani's responses, and those cut deeper, messages about how she finally found someone who saw her potential, about how I was sweet but limited, about how she deserved the life Malcolm could give her. She'd already left me in her head, already traded our 3 years for the fantasy of status and luxury, and belonging to a world that would chew her up the moment Malcolm got bored. On Wednesday night, I suggested we go out to dinner, something I never did midweek, and Imani looked surprised but pleased. I took her to a nicer place than we usually went, ordered wine I couldn't really afford, and asked about her work with genuine-seeming interest. She talked for an hour about the Henderson account, about how Malcolm trusted her with sensitive negotiations, about how the promotion announcement was coming any day now. I recorded every word on my phone tucked in my jacket pocket, the app running silently while she described meetings that hadn't happened and contributions that belonged to other people. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, told me how proud she was that I was being supportive of her career, and I squeezed back while thinking about Vanessa's timeline, about the gala that was now 10 days away. Thursday afternoon, Vanessa called with news. She'd found 2 other women, both former Crawford and Associates employees, both willing to sign affidavits about Malcolm's pattern of pursuing subordinates with promises of advancement. One had been fired when she'd refused his advances, the other had quit after months of an affair that ended with no promotion and a non-disclosure agreement Malcolm's lawyers had pressured her into signing. The pattern was clear, documented, legally actionable. Vanessa's voice carried satisfaction when she said, "We have him," and I felt something shift in my chest, the weight of betrayal transforming into the sharp edge of purpose. She needed one more piece. Proof that Malcolm was using company resources for personal affairs, specifically expense reports and corporate credit cards, the kind of financial misconduct that boards cared about more than sexual ethics. I spent Friday night at my laptop while Imani slept, hacking into Malcolm's work email using credentials I'd lifted from Imani's synchronized accounts. She'd saved his password months ago during some emergency project, and he'd never changed it because arrogance made people lazy about security. His inbox was a gold mine of carelessness. Hotel bookings in cities where no clients existed, restaurant charges for 2 during hours when he'd reported being in solo meetings, car service receipts to his Buckhead apartment during workdays when he was supposedly at the downtown office. I compiled everything into a spreadsheet with dates, amounts, and corresponding calendar entries that showed the discrepancies, then encrypted the file and sent it to Vanessa's secure email. She responded within minutes. "This is exactly what we needed. See you at the gala." The annual Crawford and Associates Gala was the kind of event where Atlanta's business elite gathered to pretend they cared about charity while really networking and showing off, and Imani had been talking about it for weeks. She'd bought a new dress, emerald green and expensive, had appointments for hair and makeup, had made me promise to wear the suit she'd bought me last Christmas. Malcolm was giving the keynote about innovative leadership and would be announcing his new senior analyst. Imani had been told to prepare remarks because she was definitely getting it. The whole evening was choreographed to be her triumph, her arrival into Malcolm's world, the moment when everyone would see that she'd made it. I played along, told her I was proud, helped her pick out jewelry, kissed her goodbye the morning of while knowing I'd be watching her entire world collapse in front of 200 witnesses. Vanessa had arranged everything with precision that bordered on art. The company's AV team thought they were loading Malcolm's presentation onto the system, but the file I'd prepared would play instead. 20 minutes of evidence, screenshots of texts, photos from the investigator, time-stamped hotel receipts, expense reports with personal charges highlighted, and a compilation of emails from the two other women describing identical patterns of promises and manipulation. The presentation would run on the main screen during Malcolm's speech, timed to start 30 seconds after he took the stage, giving him just enough time to feel confident before everything detonated. I'd tested it 3 times, verified the file couldn't be stopped once started, made sure Malcolm's tech team would be too confused to intervene before the damage was done. Saturday morning, the day of the gala, Imani woke up glowing with anticipation, and I made her breakfast one last time, scrambled eggs and toast, coffee exactly how she liked it. She sat across from me in her robe talking about what she'd say in her remarks, how she'd thank Malcolm for believing in her potential, how this was just the beginning of her career trajectory. I listened and nodded and felt nothing except the cold calculation of someone executing a plan, someone who'd moved past hurt into the mechanical efficiency of justice. She asked if I was excited to see her big moment, and I told her I wouldn't miss it for anything in the world. That part, at least, was true. She kissed me before disappearing into the bedroom to start getting ready, and I sat at the kitchen table looking at my phone, at the final text from Vanessa. It's going to be perfect. The gala took place at the High Museum, all glass architecture and dramatic lighting, with servers carrying champagne and executives in tuxedos pretending $200 a plate was reasonable for charity. Imani had left early to help with setup, which really meant she wanted time to be seen with Malcolm before the presentation, and I arrived alone wearing the suit she'd bought me, playing the supportive fiancé one last time. The main hall had been transformed into something from a magazine, round tables with white linens and centerpieces, a stage with podium and massive screen, everything designed to make Malcolm Ray look like the visionary leader his keynote would claim he was. I found my assigned seat at a table near the back, close enough to see but far enough to avoid attention, and watched Imani work the room in her green dress, radiant and confident and completely unaware. Malcolm held court near the bar, surrounded by board members and senior partners, and every few minutes Imani would drift into his orbit, their interaction careful but familiar, the kind of choreographed distance that people use when they're hiding something obvious. Vanessa sat at the head table with the other executives and their spouses, picture perfect in a navy gown, playing her role with the same precision I was playing mine. Our eyes met once across the room, and she raised her champagne glass slightly, the gesture invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. Everything was in place, every player positioned, every variable accounted for. The AV tech I'd paid $500 to swap the presentation file gave me a subtle nod from the control booth. We were ready. Dinner was served, some fusion cuisine that probably tasted fine but went down like cardboard, and I sat with strangers from the accounting department who made small talk about quarterly earnings and office politics while I counted down minutes. Imani kept glancing back at me from her table near the stage, smiling and waving like we were still a team, like she wasn't about to walk into a massacre. The speeches started around 8:30, various executives thanking donors and describing charitable initiatives in language designed to impress rather than inform. Then the CEO took the microphone and introduced Malcolm Ray, calling him the future of this company, and applause filled the room as Malcolm approached the podium looking exactly like a man who'd won. He started strong, confident, talking about innovation and leadership and building teams that drove results, and the audience hung on every word because Malcolm was good at this, had been performing his whole career. 2 minutes into the speech, right as he transitioned to announcing some exciting personnel changes, the main screen behind him flickered. Malcolm didn't notice at first, kept talking about recognizing talent and investing in the next generation. But the audience started murmuring as the first image appeared, a text message conversation between Malcolm and Imani, intimate and explicit, blown up 15 feet high behind his head. He turned, saw it, froze mid-sentence, his face draining color as the presentation advanced to the next slide. Hotel receipt, 2 guests, room service charges, his corporate card. The room erupted into chaos as the evidence kept rolling, one devastating piece after another, Malcolm's voice dying in his throat as he watched his career implode in real time. Imani stood up at her table, hand over her mouth, staring at the screen where her own words were now displayed. "Once you're divorced, we can finally be public about us." People started pulling out phones, taking photos, recording video, and I saw board members huddling with the CEO, saw HR directors frantically typing, saw Vanessa sitting perfectly still with something like satisfaction carved into her expression. Malcolm tried to speak, stammered something about technical difficulties and misunderstanding, but his microphone had been cut, another detail Vanessa had arranged, and his voice couldn't carry over the growing noise of 200 people processing scandal in real time. Imani pushed through the crowd toward the stage, her face wild with panic, and grabbed Malcolm's arm like he could fix this, like he could make it stop. He shook her off, literally pushed her away as the final slides appeared. Affidavits from the two other women, expense reports with personal charges highlighted, an email from Malcolm to Imani promising her the promotion and everything else, after she kept being patient. Security moved toward the stage as someone in the crowd shouted a question, then another, the orderly gala dissolving into press conference as reporters who'd been covering the charity angle realized they'd stumbled onto something better. I saw Imani scan the room looking for me, her eyes desperate, but I was already moving toward the exit where Vanessa stood waiting, a small smile on her face and an envelope in her hands. We walked out together through the service entrance while behind us the gala turned into crime scene, leaving Malcolm and Imani to face consequences we'd engineered with patience and precision. The next morning, the story was everywhere. Local news, business journals, social media feeding frenzy. Crawford and Associates executive caught in misconduct scandal ran on the Atlanta Journal-Constitution with photos from the gala. Malcolm's shocked face on screens across the city. Imani's name mentioned as employee involved in affair with supervisor. My phone exploded with calls and texts from Imani, dozens of them, desperate voicemails where she cycled through denial and accusation and begging. "Someone hacked the system," she said in one message. "Malcolm thinks you did this," she said in another. "Please call me. Please, we need to talk. This is all a huge mistake." I listened to each one once, then deleted them, her voice already starting to sound like a stranger's. By Monday, Crawford and Associates had issued a statement placing Malcolm Ray on immediate administrative leave pending investigation, and the board had launched a full audit of his expense reports and personnel decisions. The two women who'd signed affidavits were suddenly credible, their stories corroborated by the evidence that had played at the gala, and employment lawyers were circling the company like sharks sensing blood. Imani had been suspended too, pending the HR investigation into whether she'd known about the expense fraud or had benefited from preferential treatment. Her social media went dark, her number disconnected, and through mutual acquaintances I heard she'd moved back with her mother in Decatur. The promotion she'd sacrificed everything for evaporated, and worse, her name was now attached to scandal in an industry that remembered this kind of thing forever. Wednesday afternoon, Malcolm released a statement through his lawyer claiming he'd been targeted by a disgruntled employee, and that the evidence was taken out of context, but nobody was buying it. The expense reports were too clear, the pattern too documented, the other women too credible. Vanessa filed for divorce that same day, and her father's law firm made sure the filing was public record, available for every journalist writing about the scandal. The details were devastating. She was seeking dissolution based on infidelity and financial misconduct, asking for everything including the Buckhead apartment where the affair had taken place. Malcolm's assets would be frozen pending investigation, his reputation destroyed, his career effectively over before the investigation even concluded. I went to work like normal that week, fixing networks and installing security systems, but my phone kept buzzing with job offers forwarded from Vanessa. Her connections had done their work. Corporate law firms needed cybersecurity consultants, tech startups wanted forensic specialists, and somehow my name kept appearing in conversations about Atlanta's best investigators. I'd gone from anonymous freelancer to someone people wanted in their corner, and the transformation felt surreal every time I deposited a retainer check that had more zeros than my old monthly income. Vanessa's consulting contract started officially on the first of the month, but she'd already been sending me clients, building the foundation for what she promised would be the most successful security firm in the Southeast. Friday night, exactly 1 week after the gala, I packed up Imani's belongings from our apartment, clothes and books and all the pieces of the life we'd built together. I'd already given notice on the lease, already signed papers on a new place in Midtown, one of those modern lofts with floor-to-ceiling windows and rent I could now actually afford. Her mother came to pick up the boxes, and we stood in awkward silence while she loaded her car, neither of us mentioning what had happened or what Imani had done or what I'd done in response. "She made a mistake," her mother said finally, and I nodded because it was easier than saying she'd made 100 mistakes over 3 months and called each one love. The mother drove away with the boxes, and I closed the door on that chapter with more relief than pain. The calls from Imani continued for another week, then slowed, then stopped, replaced by a lawyer's letter requesting I preserve any evidence of hacking or illegal surveillance for potential litigation. Vanessa's lawyers responded with my own letter detailing that all evidence had been obtained legally as the authorized administrator of accounts I'd been given access to, and that any litigation would require Imani to explain under oath why she'd shared Malcolm's credentials with me in the first place. The threat dissolved after that, replaced by silence that felt like its own kind of victory. Malcolm's investigation concluded with termination for cause, loss of severance, and referral to prosecutors for potential fraud charges. Crawford and Associates settled quietly with the 2 other women, and the whole situation became a cautionary tale about executive accountability that business schools would probably study for years. 3 weeks after the gala, Vanessa invited me to her lawyer's office in Buckhead. Not the Buckhead apartment that had housed Betrayal, but a gleaming tower that housed her father's firm. She sat across from me in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, and between us on the polished table was a contract that represented everything Malcolm had promised Imani and more. The consulting agreement we discussed in that Virginia Highland restaurant had evolved into a partnership offer. Vanessa was launching RaceX Solutions, a cybersecurity firm targeting corporate clients, and she wanted me as co-founder and chief technical officer. The equity split was 60-40 in her favor, but the salary was $250,000 base plus performance bonuses, and the client list she'd already assembled included 3 Fortune 500 companies and a dozen law firms. "You destroyed him with precision," Vanessa said, signing her copy of the agreement with a fountain pen that probably cost more than my old laptop. "Most people would have caused a scene, thrown punches, done something emotional that would have made them look worse than him. But you documented everything, stayed patient, and delivered evidence that was legally bulletproof. That's the skill set I need, someone who understands that the best revenge is the kind that looks like justice." She slid the pen across to me, and I signed next to my name printed in letters that still felt like they belonged to someone else. Darius Cole, Chief Technical Officer. It looked real on paper, sounded real when she introduced me to her father afterward, felt real when I walked out of that building with business cards being printed and an office space being prepared. The next month moved like a dream I kept expecting to wake from. RaceX Solutions launched with press coverage that mentioned my innovative forensic methodology, clients signed contracts for security audits and digital investigations, and I hired a team of 3 specialists to handle the workload that Vanessa's connections kept generating. We moved into an office near the Beltline, modern and professional, the kind of space where serious business happened and serious money changed hands. I bought furniture and equipment, hired an office manager, set up systems and protocols that turned my freelance hustle into a legitimate operation. Every morning I'd drive to that office in a car I'd leased instead of bought, wearing clothes that actually fit instead of the thrift store suits I'd been rotating for years, and I'd think about Malcolm Ray's face when that presentation started playing. Vanessa and I fell into an easy working relationship built on mutual respect and shared understanding of what betrayal felt like, what recovery required. She handled the business development and client relations with natural charm that came from growing up in Atlanta's elite circles, while I handled the technical operations and team management with the focus of someone who'd spent years building expertise nobody had valued properly. We never talked about Malcolm or Imani directly, but they were present in every client we took, every system we secured, every investigation we conducted with thoroughness that bordered on obsessive. The company grew faster than either of us had projected, and by month 3, we were profitable. By month 6, we were turning away clients. By month 9, we were opening a second office and hiring from firms that had rejected my applications 2 years earlier. But success felt hollow sometimes. Late at night in my new apartment when the city lights stretched across the windows and I was alone with the silence. I'd won the revenge game, had come out ahead by every measurable metric, better job, better income, better future, but the victory tasted like ash mixed with satisfaction. Imani was effectively blacklisted in corporate Atlanta, working retail according to mutual acquaintances who still talked to both of us, living with her mother at 29 and starting over in ways that would take years to recover from. Malcolm had declared bankruptcy, was facing misdemeanor fraud charges, and his wife had taken everything in the divorce settlement that finalized in record time. I'd destroyed them both without ever raising my voice or throwing a punch, and most days that felt right, felt earned, felt like the natural consequence of their choices. Then, on a Thursday evening, 3 months into my new life, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I'd deleted but still recognized. "I know you don't want to hear from me, but I need to talk. Please. Just coffee. I'm at Morrison's on Highland." I stared at the message for 5 full minutes, my thumb hovering over the delete button, every rational part of my brain saying to ignore it, to let the past stay buried, to keep moving forward into the future I'd built from the wreckage. But another part, smaller and probably stupider, wanted to see what Imani looked like after 3 months of consequences, wanted to hear what excuse or apology or justification she'd constructed, wanted to close that chapter face-to-face instead of through lawyers and blocked numbers. I grabbed my keys and drove to Virginia Highland, telling myself I was strong enough to handle this, mature enough to stay cold, smart enough not to fall for whatever game she was playing. Morrison's Coffee sat on North Highland in the kind of neighborhood that had gentrified from gritty to trendy, and I found parking 2 blocks away, walking slowly enough to give myself time to prepare for whatever version of Imani was waiting. She sat at a corner table, visible through the window, and I almost didn't recognize her. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by jeans and a plain sweater, her hair pulled back without the expensive styling, her face bare of the makeup she used to spend an hour applying. She looked younger and more tired simultaneously, like someone who'd aged backward into a version of herself from before ambition, and Malcolm Ray had rewired her priorities. When she saw me approaching, her expression cycled through relief and fear and something close to shame before settling on careful neutrality. I sat across from her without ordering anything, my body language deliberately closed, and waited for her to start because I'd learned patience in ways she couldn't imagine. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice smaller than I remembered, lacking the confidence that used to fill rooms. "I wasn't sure you would." I didn't respond, just looked at her with the face I'd practiced in mirrors, the one that showed nothing, gave nothing, promised nothing. She twisted her hands together on the table, a nervous gesture she'd never done before, and launched into what sounded like a rehearsed speech about mistakes and regret and understanding that I'd done what I had to do. The words sounded hollow even as she said them, apologies without understanding, remorse without accountability, and I let her finish before speaking. "Why am I here, Imani?" I asked, cutting through the performance to the point. She looked startled by the directness, like she'd expected me to still be the soft man who brought her flowers at work, who believed her stories, who never questioned when things didn't add up. "I wanted to explain," she said. "I wanted you to know that Malcolm promised me things, that I thought I was building a future, that I never meant to hurt you." I laughed at that, couldn't help it, the sound bitter in the coffee shop's ambient noise. You wrote emails about how I was sweet but limited, I said. You told him I was holding you back. You planned your whole future around a man who was running the same game on 3 other women. So don't tell me you never meant to hurt me. You meant it. You just didn't mean to get caught. She flinched like I'd hit her, tears starting down her face, and part of me felt something close to satisfaction watching her realize I wasn't who she remembered. I lost everything, she whispered. My job, my apartment, my reputation. I'm 29 living with my mother working at Target. Do you know what that feels like? I leaned forward, keeping my voice level, making sure she heard every word. Yes, I said. I know exactly what it feels like to lose everything. I felt it standing in that office lobby watching your boss adjust his belt, watching you lie to my face, watching you come home and pretend you loved me while planning your exit strategy. The difference is, I didn't lose everything because of my choices. You did. You gambled on Malcolm, and you lost. That's not tragedy. That's consequences. Imani pulled out her phone and showed me her screen. Applications to jobs she'd never get, rejection emails citing concerns about professional judgment, social media messages from former co-workers who'd turned on her after the scandal. I can't even get interviews, she said. Your name comes up in searches now. Successful tech entrepreneur, the man who exposed corporate corruption. And mine comes up attached to affair and fraud. We both came out of the same situation, but somehow you're thriving and I'm destroyed. How is that fair? I stood up, done with this conversation, done with her victim narrative, done with the woman who'd traded our relationship for a fantasy that never existed. It's fair because I played smart and you played stupid, I said. You wanted to climb by sleeping your way up. I climbed by being better than everyone underestimated me to be. We're not in the same situation. We never were. I walked out of that coffee shop and didn't look back, didn't feel guilt or satisfaction or anything except the cold clarity of someone who'd made peace with necessary cruelty. My phone rang as I reached my car, Vanessa calling with news about a new client, a tech startup needing comprehensive security architecture, the kind of project that would require weeks of work and pay, enough to cover my apartment for 3 months. I took the call leaning against my car, a charcoal Audi A6 I'd leased 2 months ago when my old Honda finally died, and discussed timelines and deliverables with the professional competence of someone who belonged in these conversations. Behind me, through the coffee shop window, I could see Imani still sitting at that table crying into her hands, and I felt nothing watching her fall apart. That indifference, more than anything, told me I'd moved on. The drive back to Midtown took 20 minutes through evening traffic, and I used the time to prep for tomorrow's client meeting, running through security protocols and recommendations in my head with the same focus I'd once used to track Imani's betrayal. My apartment building rose 30 stories of glass and steel, dramatically different from the modest complex where we'd lived together, and the lobby security greeted me by name as I headed toward the elevator. The loft was still sparsely furnished. I'd been too busy building the business to care about interior design, but the view stretched across the city in a way that made decorating seem irrelevant. I made coffee, opened my laptop, and answered emails until midnight, falling into the rhythm of work that had replaced everything else in my life. The next morning brought a surprise that complicated my carefully constructed emotional detachment. Vanessa forwarded me an email from Imani requesting a meeting about potential employment opportunities at RaySec Solutions. The message was formal and professional, her name at the bottom with a new email address that didn't reference Crawford & Associates, and the whole thing felt like either desperation or strategy. Vanessa's note above the forward said simply, "Your call. I'm neutral." I stared at the message for 10 minutes trying to decode the angle, trying to figure out what Imani thought she could gain from approaching the company founded by the 2 people who'd destroyed her career. The smart move was to ignore it, to let her fade into the background of a chapter I'd closed. But curiosity won out over wisdom, and I replied with a meeting time for that afternoon. She arrived exactly on time wearing business casual that looked like it came from Target's professional section, carrying a leather folder that had seen better days, her entire presentation screaming, trying too hard to look put together. I met her in our small conference room rather than my office, keeping the setting neutral and businesslike, and gestured for her to sit without offering coffee or small talk. Imani launched into a pitch about her qualifications, her degree in business analytics, her 3 years of experience before everything fell apart, her willingness to start in any entry-level position. She'd clearly researched the company, mentioned specific clients and services, tried to demonstrate that she understood what we did and could contribute. It might have been compelling if I didn't know exactly why she was really here. What do you actually want? I interrupted, stopping her mid-sentence about synergies between analytical skills and security work. She deflated slightly, the professional mask slipping, and I saw the real Imani underneath, broke, desperate, running out of options. "I need a job," she said quietly. "I need a reference that isn't from Crawford and Associates. I need a chance to rebuild my reputation. And I thought maybe, since we both came out of that situation, since you obviously landed on your feet, you might understand what it's like to need a second chance." The logic was almost sound, the appeal to shared experience almost clever, but she'd miscalculated who I'd become in the months since that gala. The man who'd brought her flowers might have felt sympathy. The man sitting across from her now saw only risk and liability. I opened the leather folder I'd brought and pulled out a document, sliding it across the table between us. "What's this?" she asked, reaching for it with visible confusion. "It's a non-disclosure agreement," I said. "The one you and Malcolm signed 4 months into your affair, when you started handling confidential client information, and he wanted to make sure you couldn't leverage what you knew if things went bad." Her face went pale as she opened it, seeing her signature next to Malcolm's, seeing the language that proved she'd known exactly what she was doing, that the affair hadn't been some spontaneous passion but a calculated arrangement with legal protections. "How did you get this?" she whispered, and I smiled without warmth. "I get everything eventually. It's what I do." The document had come from Vanessa's divorce discovery, one of hundreds of files Malcolm's lawyers had been forced to turn over, and I'd kept it specifically for this moment, this inevitable attempt at contact, this predictable play for sympathy. "You knew Malcolm was married," I said. "You signed legal documents acknowledging the affair and promising discretion. You participated in expense fraud by letting him use corporate cards for personal trips. And you wrote emails explicitly discussing taking my place once the divorce was finalized. This isn't a woman who made a mistake. This is someone who planned to trade up and got caught. So, when you ask me for a second chance, I want you to understand that I know exactly who you are and what you're capable of." Imani stared at the document like it was a bomb, her hands shaking slightly, all her prepared arguments evaporating. "I made terrible choices," she said finally, her voice breaking. "I was ambitious and stupid, and I believed Malcolm when I should have known better. But I loved you once, really loved you, and that has to count for something." I collected the document and returned it to my folder, preparing to end this meeting and this chapter permanently. "It doesn't count for anything," I said. "You loved who you thought I was, safe, predictable, someone who'd never figure it out. You didn't love me enough to be honest, to end things properly, to treat me with basic respect. And now you want me to hire you, to give you access to client information, to trust you with the company I built from the ashes of what you destroyed. The answer is no, Imani. It was always going to be no. This meeting was me being generous enough to tell you in person." Imani left the office without another word, and I watched from my window as she walked to her car, head down, shoulders shaking with what might have been crying or rage or defeat. I felt nothing watching her go except mild relief that the confrontation was over, that the past had tried to resurface and I'd successfully buried it again. But Imani's appearance had dislodged something I thought I'd processed completely. The realization that her suffering didn't actually make me feel better, that revenge had been satisfying, but closure remained elusive, that winning the game hadn't healed the wound of being betrayed in the first place. I sat at my desk for an hour after she left, staring at nothing, trying to understand why her desperation left me feeling empty instead of vindicated. That evening, I met Vanessa for drinks at a bar in Buckhead, our usual Thursday debrief about business and clients and company growth. She'd asked about the meeting with Imani, and I described it clinically, factually, leaving out the complicated emotions that had surfaced during and after. Vanessa listened with the focus she brought to everything, then said something that shifted my perspective. "You know the difference between you and Malcolm. He destroyed people accidentally, as collateral damage to his ego. You destroyed him intentionally, as justice for what he'd done. But Imani was collateral damage to your justice, and I think that bothers you more than you want to admit." She was right, frustratingly right, and I admitted that seeing Imani broken hadn't felt as good as I'd imagined it would. "Here's what I learned from my divorce," Vanessa said, ordering another drink. "Revenge doesn't actually heal anything. It just redistributes the pain. Malcolm got what he deserved, and that was necessary and right. But Imani's suffering doesn't fix what she did to you, doesn't undo the betrayal, doesn't restore the time you lost or the trust she violated. At some point, you have to let the anger go, not because she deserves forgiveness, but because carrying it is costing you more than it's worth." I understood the logic intellectually, but emotionally, I was still stuck in the loop of calculating who'd hurt who worse, who'd won more completely, who'd emerged from the wreckage with fewer scars. Vanessa watched me process this with the patience of someone who'd been exactly where I was, and eventually said, "Give it time. The sharpness fades." The next morning, I woke to missed calls from 3 different journalists and a text from Vanessa. "Turn on Channel 2. I pulled up the news on my laptop and saw Malcolm Ray's face filling the screen. Mugshot from his arrest overnight on fraud charges that had finally moved from investigation to prosecution. The story had everything media loved: corporate scandal, sex, money, and now criminal consequences. But buried in the coverage was a detail I hadn't expected. Imani had cooperated with prosecutors, providing testimony about Malcolm's expense fraud and his pattern of manipulating subordinates, likely as part of a plea deal to avoid her own charges. Her name was mentioned as key witness, rather than co-conspirator, and the implication was clear: she'd traded Malcolm's prosecution for her own immunity. I called Vanessa immediately, and she was already laughing before I said anything. "She played it perfectly," Vanessa said, "went to prosecutors before they came to her, offered everything she knew, positioned herself as victim rather than participant. Malcolm's lawyers are going to destroy her credibility on the stand, but the prosecutors don't care. They have the expense reports and emails regardless of whether her testimony holds up. She just guaranteed he goes to prison." There was admiration in Vanessa's voice, the respect of one strategist for another, and I realized Imani had learned something from our revenge after all, that survival meant being willing to sacrifice anyone, including the person who'd promised you everything. Malcolm would serve time, would emerge broken and unemployable, would spend years rebuilding from nothing, and Imani would avoid prison, avoid fraud charges, and maybe eventually rebuild a career somewhere far from Atlanta. That night, I opened the encrypted folder I'd maintained throughout the investigation, the one labeled Network Backup 2024, that contained every piece of evidence I'd gathered. I scrolled through screenshots and recordings and documents that represented 3 months of my life spent documenting betrayal, and I felt the weight of it settling onto my shoulders like something I'd been carrying too long. Vanessa's words echoed. Revenge doesn't heal anything. It just redistributes pain. I'd redistributed Malcolm's and Imani's pain across their entire lives, had ensured they'd carry consequences for years. But I was still carrying the original wound, still checking my phone for messages from a woman I'd deleted, still calculating the score in a game that nobody actually wins. I closed the laptop and sat in my loft looking out at Atlanta's lights, trying to figure out what came after revenge, what filled the space once justice was served. The answer, I was starting to understand, wasn't another person or another victory. It was simply time, and the slow work of building a life defined by what I was moving toward instead of what I'd escaped from. RaySec Solutions was successful. My reputation was solid, my income was stable. Those were facts, achievements, evidence that I'd survived and adapted and eventually thrived. But thriving wasn't the same as healing, and healing required something I hadn't been willing to give yet. The acknowledgement that Imani and Malcolm had taken something from me that revenge couldn't restore. The only way forward was to stop measuring my life against theirs, to stop checking news articles about Malcolm's trial or wondering what Imani was doing in Decatur. The only way forward was to actually move forward, to let the past become history instead of ammunition. 6 months after the gala, Malcolm Ray's trial concluded with guilty verdicts on 3 counts of fraud and 2 counts of misappropriation of corporate funds. He received 18 months in federal prison with 3 years probation, and the coverage noted his fall from corporate success to convicted felon, with the kind of narrative arc that journalists loved. Imani's testimony had been damaging despite defense efforts to discredit her, but ultimately the documentary evidence I'd compiled had done the heavy lifting. Emails, expense reports, hotel receipts, all stamped with dates and charges that couldn't be explained away. I watched the verdict announced on my office television with Vanessa beside me, and we shared a moment of quiet satisfaction that felt more like relief than triumph. It was over, truly over. Every legal consequence delivered, every score settled. RaySec Solutions landed its biggest contract that same week, a 3-year security partnership with a Fortune 100 company that would triple our revenue and require hiring 15 new employees. Vanessa and I celebrated with the team at a restaurant in Midtown, the kind of place with craft cocktails and small plates, and I looked around the table at people I'd hired, people who trusted my judgment and expertise, people who saw me as successful rather than damaged. The conversation flowed easily about expansion plans and office space and hiring strategies. And somewhere in the middle of discussing quarterly projections, I realized I'd gone an entire day without thinking about Imani or Malcolm. The obsession had finally broken, replaced by the simple momentum of building something that mattered. I stopped checking news articles about the trial, stopped monitoring Imani's sparse social media presence, stopped calculating who'd suffered more or won more completely. The silence where that obsession had lived felt strange at first, like phantom pain from an amputated limb, but gradually it filled with other things. Work projects that challenged me, friendships with team members who became more than employees, hobbies I'd abandoned during the 3 months of investigation and revenge. I started running again, early mornings through Piedmont Park before the city woke up, and the physical exhaustion helped quiet the mental noise that used to keep me awake analyzing every detail of the betrayal. The runs became meditation, the rhythm of footsteps and breathing replacing the rhythm of anger and calculation that had driven me for so long. One Saturday morning, 3 months after Malcolm's sentencing, I was having coffee at a place in Virginia Highland when I saw Imani across the street loading boxes into a U-Haul truck. She looked different again, healthier than when she'd come begging for a job, more composed than when she'd been crying in Morrison's, like someone who'd finally accepted her new reality and was making peace with it. A man about her age helped her lift furniture, laughing at something she said, and I watched them work together with the easy familiarity of people who'd known each other a while. She was leaving Atlanta, I realized, starting over somewhere the scandal wouldn't follow, somewhere her name didn't immediately trigger Google results about affairs and fraud. Part of me wanted to feel satisfaction seeing her reduced to loading her own moving truck, but mostly I just felt tired of the whole narrative. She looked up as if sensing someone watching, and our eyes met across the street for 3 seconds that felt longer. Neither of us waved or acknowledged the other beyond that locked gaze, and then she turned back to the truck and I turned back to my coffee, both of us choosing to let the moment pass without confrontation or closure. That, I realized, was the real ending, not dramatic or satisfying, not filled with final speeches or emotional revelations, just 2 people who'd destroyed each other in different ways moving on with separate lives. The man helping her load boxes put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him briefly before picking up another box. Whoever he was, whatever they were, it wasn't my business or my concern. That indifference felt like freedom. My phone buzzed with a message from Vanessa. "Breakfast tomorrow? Want to discuss the new office space." I replied, confirming the time, then finished my coffee watching Virginia Highland wake up on a Saturday morning. People walking dogs and pushing strollers and living ordinary lives uncomplicated by revenge and scandal. The neighborhood looked different than it had 6 months ago when I'd met Vanessa in that restaurant to plan Malcolm's destruction. Brighter somehow, less weighted with purpose and anger. I paid my bill and walked back to my car thinking about the office expansion, about hiring decisions and client onboarding and all the practical concerns that now filled the space where plotting and documenting and calculating had lived. The work was boring compared to revenge, but boring felt sustainable in ways that constant anger never had. Sunday evening, I stood in my loft watching the sun set over Atlanta, painting the sky in oranges and purples that reflected off glass towers downtown. The city looked beautiful from 30 stories up, looked full of possibility instead of pain, looked like somewhere I could actually build a future instead of just escape a past. My phone sat silent on the counter. No desperate messages from Imani. No news alerts about Malcolm. No updates about trials or investigations or scandal. Just silence. Blessed and complete. The kind that came from finally being done with a chapter that had consumed too much of my life. I made dinner, something simple I'd learned to cook in the months of living alone, and ate it watching the city lights come on one building at a time as darkness settled over the skyline. The next morning, I arrived at the office before anyone else and stood in the empty space looking at desks and equipment and whiteboards covered with project timelines. RaceX Solutions had become real, substantial, successful beyond what I'd imagined when Vanessa first offered me the partnership. We'd built something that mattered, that helped clients protect their assets and information, that employed people and generated revenue and contributed value to the world. It wasn't revenge. It was the opposite of revenge, the constructive response to destruction, the proof that losing everything could become the foundation for building something better. Vanessa arrived with coffee and donuts, her usual Monday morning ritual, and we spent an hour reviewing the week's priorities with the comfortable efficiency of partners who trusted each other completely. At lunch, I took a walk around the Beltline, the converted rail line that circled the city, and past couples and families and people living lives that had nothing to do with betrayal or revenge or corporate scandal. A kid on a bike almost ran into me, apologized with the automatic politeness of Southern raising, and kept going without knowing or caring who I was or what I'd done. That anonymity felt like gift, like permission to be someone other than the man who exposed Malcolm Ray, or Imani's ex-fiancée, or any of the labels that had defined me for months. I was just Darius Cole, 33 years old, CTO of a growing company, someone trying to figure out what came after winning. The answer, I was learning, was simply living, not for revenge or redemption, but for the ordinary accumulation of days that eventually added up to a life. That night, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Hope you're well. Heard about your company's success. You deserved better than what I gave you. Take care." I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the keyboard, considering responses that ranged from bitter to gracious to simply leaving it unanswered. Eventually, I typed 5 words. "Take care of yourself, too." Then I deleted Imani's new number, deleted the conversation, and returned to the work email I'd been answering. The exchange had taken 90 seconds of my life, and I was okay with that being all the time it deserved. Some chapters closed with dramatic confrontations, some closed with trials and sentencing, and some closed with brief messages that acknowledged the past without dwelling in it. Vanessa called an hour later with news about a potential acquisition, a smaller security firm in Charlotte that wanted to be absorbed into RaceX's growing network. The conversation lasted 45 minutes, covered financials and logistics and strategic planning, and never once touched on Malcolm or revenge or anything related to how we'd met. We'd moved past origin stories into the practical work of building an empire, and that transition felt like graduating from one phase of life into another. "By the way," Vanessa said as we were wrapping up, My father asked if you'd be interested in joining his firm's cybersecurity board. It's advisory, meets quarterly, pays well, and looks great on a resume. I accepted without hesitation, understanding that doors were opening now that had been locked when I was just a freelance tech fixing computers for small businesses. The week moved forward with the steady rhythm of success, client meetings and project deliverables and team management that kept me busy from morning until evening. I fell into bed exhausted each night, the good kind of tired that came from productive work rather than obsessive investigation, and slept deeply without dreams of confrontation or revenge. The past was finally becoming past, stored in memory rather than active in present consciousness, acknowledged but not defining. Malcolm Ray was in prison, Imani had left Atlanta, and I was building something that had nothing to do with either of them. That separation felt like the real victory, more meaningful than public humiliation or legal consequences, the simple ability to move forward without constantly looking back. Friday evening, the team gathered for drinks to celebrate landing another major client, and I found myself laughing at someone's joke about office politics, genuinely present in the moment rather than performing presence while thinking about something else. These people knew me as Darius the CTO, not Darius the betrayed fiancé, and that identity felt cleaner somehow, less complicated by history and hurt. We stayed at the bar until midnight, and I drove home through Atlanta's empty streets feeling something close to contentment, the kind that came from knowing tomorrow would bring more work and more progress and more distance from who I'd been when this all started. The city looked different at night, quieter and more honest, and I navigated familiar streets thinking about office expansion and hiring plans instead of revenge strategies. Saturday morning brought an email from a business magazine requesting an interview about RaySec's innovative approach to corporate security and my unique background in forensic investigation. The questions they sent focused on methodology and technology, on how I'd built expertise and what separated our firm from competitors. There was no mention of Malcolm or Crawford and Associates or the scandal that had launched everything. My reputation had finally separated from that origin story, had become substantial enough to stand independently. I scheduled the interview for next week and spent the rest of the weekend preparing talking points that highlighted our work rather than my past, that positioned me as expert rather than victim-turned-victor. The shift in narrative felt significant, like permission to be someone other than the man defined by revenge. Sunday evening, I sat in my loft with my laptop reviewing quarterly reports and strategic projections, the kind of paperwork that used to bore me but now represented tangible proof of progress and success. The numbers told a story of growth. Revenue up 40% quarter over quarter, client retention at 95%, team satisfaction scores in the high 80s. We were building something that worked, that lasted, that mattered beyond the revenge that had motivated its creation. Vanessa had been right months ago when she said the best revenge was building something excellent, not because it hurt Malcolm or proved anything to Imani, but because excellence was its own reward, its own purpose, its own justification. The company had become bigger than our combined anger, had transcended origin into entity. Now, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Darius's place? Leave your comment like this video, and don't forget to subscribe. And if you want another powerful story, click on the video appearing to your left.